So in our first video on hypothesis testing, we tried to introduce the step-by-step procedure. It probably doesn't mean a whole lot to you right now, as we haven't broken down those steps one at a time. But we did talk about what a hypothesis is. A hypothesis is just a claim about a parameter, which in our case, we're going to be making claims about population mean. So we want to talk about different types of hypotheses. We're going to talk about the null hypothesis versus the alternative hypothesis. So first, what is a null hypothesis? A null hypothesis is denoted by the symbol H sub 0. H sub 0. So anytime you see H sub 0, that refers to the null hypothesis, and it involves a claim that has equality. So the equal sign, equality. Yep, so in our case, the null hypothesis, H0, is always going to be about the mean is equal to something. The mean is equal to something. So it's always going to be the mean equals some number. So it always involves the condition of equality. That's key, right? Null hypothesis, H sub 0, always involves equality. And it's going to be the parameter that we're going to be dealing with is going to be mean. As for the alternative hypothesis, if I can spell that, get it going. So it's denoted in the following way. H1, H sub 1. So alternative hypothesis is written H sub 1, and it does not involve equality. It does not involve equality. So it involves a claim without equality. It involves a claim without equality. Let me put it that way. It involves a claim without equality. So there are actually three possibilities that could occur for your alternative hypothesis. So H1 could be involving, in our case, we're dealing with population means, right? That's our parameter, population mean in this class. It could be not equal to a number, right? That's one way not to get equality. Or another possibility, it could be H1. The alternative is that the mean is less than a number. Mean is less than some number. Or the alternative hypothesis could be the alternative H1 is the mean is, oops, wrong color. The mean is greater than a number, right? There are three different possibilities. Greater than a number. So if you're not equal to something, or I mean rather if you don't involve equality, you might be not equal to, you might be less than, or you might be greater than. Those are three ways to get non-equality. So alternatives always have non-equality. All right, so we want to learn how to do the first step to a hypothesis test, which is setting up the null and alternative hypotheses. So here we're going to have a claim for each of these that needs to be tested. So here are some examples. So number one, we're going to have a claim. U.S. women have an average lifespan more than 75 years. U.S. women have an average lifespan more than 75 years. So we want to write our null and alternative hypothesis. Null and alternative hypothesis. This is the first step to a hypothesis test, identifying the null and alternative hypothesis. So H1 is the alternative, H0 is the null. So we're going to first do the null. The null. So the null hypothesis, so you do H sub 0 and you put a colon, right? You put a colon right there. So that is always about equality, right? So the mean, right? We're talking about average here. That's the mean of the population. Is going to be equal to 75. So it always involves equality. The number here is 75. So the null always involves equality. So key here is it's equal, always equal when you're dealing with the null. Now the alternative we're going to figure out, H1, based on maybe the wording in the problem. So I got H1 and I put a nice colon, make sure you put a colon, and then it's about the average. So if you read the wording carefully, let's read the wording really carefully. Average is more than 75. So I'm writing down the average. Mean is more than, so that word is more than, that's greater than 75. Yep. So the null always is equal to the null. Yeah, and the alternative you're going to figure out based on your wording in the claim. Based on the wording in the claim. So we got that first one done. We have the null hypothesis is the population mean equals 75. The alternative is that the population mean is bigger than 75, more than 75. Let's do another. 2. How about, here's our claim. The average Tennessee salary annually is less than $60,000 US. All right, so we want to set up a null and alternative hypothesis. Identify the null and alternative hypothesis. All right, so we're ready to start, right? We got H0 is the null. Put a colon after that. And H1 is the alternative. So the mean equals a number is always the null hypothesis, right? The null is always about the mean equals a number. So we're talking about the average Tennessee salary is less than $60,000. So we have average $60,000. So we're going to set the average equal to 60,000 for the null. So again, the null always involves equality. Always involves equality. So you always make the mean equal. Now, the alternative will involve something besides equality. It might be less than, it might be greater than, it could be not equal to. If you read the claim here carefully, the average, that's the mean, is less than, if you read that word less than right there, that's going to be, use the less than symbol, 60,000. So mu is less than 60,000. That is our alternative. So this is actually the claim that we're testing right here. If I go back to the previous one, the claim that we're testing was more than. So this was, in the previous one, this was the claim that we were testing here. I should have written that. That's the actual claim being stated there. All right, let's do a third one. Let's do a third one, number 3. So we have a claim. On average, U.S. drivers drive 15,000 miles. $15,000 per year. Okay, so we want to identify the null and alternative hypothesis. Identify null and alternative. Hypothesis. So we're going to write H0 for the null hypothesis and put a colon. Then H1 for the alternative and put a colon. So the null is H0, the alternative is H1. And this is going to be about the mean, the population mean, right? The average. And remember, the null always involves the equal sign. You have another number here showing that, right? 15,000. So the mean is 15,000 is the null hypothesis. Now, to find the alternative, we want to read the actual claim, the wording of the claim. So here the average is claimed to be, so U.S. drivers drive, so it's claimed to be 15,000. So wait a second. That's actually the null hypothesis, right? The average is 15,000. So this is actually the claim that we're trying to test. Right? We're actually trying to test that the mean is 15,000. So actually our claim is the null hypothesis in this case. So anytime you have the null hypothesis is the claim that's trying to be tested, the alternative is going to be that the mean is not 15,000. Mean is not 15,000. So that's something you have to keep in mind. Yeah. So we actually have the claim here. The claim is the null hypothesis. And when that happens, the alternative will be not equal to. Not equal to. Yeah, so in the other two, notice in the other two, the actual claim was the alternative. The actual claim was the alternative. It's a little different. All right, let's do another one. Number 4. Let's say this is our claim. Last year's average rainfall was different than .38 inches. Last year's average rainfall was different than 38 inches. Okay, so we want to set up a null hypothesis. Identify the null and alternative. Hypothesis. So H0 is the null. So you write H0 and a colon. H1 is the alternative. So what do we have here? So we're talking about the average was different than. The average was different than. So remember the null always is about equality. So you're going to have the mean. The mean is 38 equals. So it always involves equality. Now, let's try to figure out the alternative. If you read the statement, average was different than 38, that means not equal to, right? Not equal to. So the average was not equal to 38. So this is actually the claim that's being tested, that the mean is not 38, right? It's different than. All right. So that's a good intro to being able to identify null hypotheses and alternative hypotheses. Step 1 of the process in hypothesis testing.